All right, you might make a start. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Genetic Hub webinar tonight. Joining us tonight is our guest presenter, Dione Howard from Riverina Local Lands Services. Talking you through a variety of areas within animal health, especially during this time when Mother Nature is throwing everything at us. So we hope you gain some valuable knowledge tonight, which you can implement into your herd. As we are currently experiencing even more wild weather today, I hope you and your animals stay well and there's some warmer days ahead. And just before I pass you over to Dione, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you could please keep your microphones on mute and videos off, and you are welcome to submit any questions in the chat box when we get to question time a little bit later. But for now, I'll hand you over to our industry expert presenter, Dione. Thanks, Dione.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Zoe, and thank you for having me along tonight. I would like to kick things off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from where we're all zooming in from tonight. That's the Wiradjuri people from where I am here in Wagga, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So, yeah, thanks for having me along tonight to chat about a whole range of different things affecting the beef industry. I've got a few things that I'm going to tackle tonight with you all on board. I'll just check that this has gone to the next slide. Zoe, is that?
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, awesome. Just checking that all the technology is happening. So the plan for tonight, we're going to go through a few, what I would say, like fundamentals of animal nutrition. So that's everything from the feed base to feed quality, and just some key points to prevent metabolic diseases, which in our role as district vets is just a really common thing that we see. I will go into the post-flood animal health impacts and some considerations there. Where I'm based in Wagga Wagga, we haven't as such seen a lot of flooding in this particular season. Hopefully it doesn't become an issue for us in the coming weeks with the rainfall events that we're seeing, but I'll draw on some experiences and some feedback that we've had from the North Coast Local Land Services, which is where some of you may be zooming in from tonight, and draw on their learnings and hopefully pull out a few key points there for you guys to take away and hopefully have in preparation. But yeah, hopefully we don't have to experience any of those adverse events in the coming weeks again. And then, because that is also a big part of my job, I will touch on biosecurity as well, in particular foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. And in case some of you aren't super familiar with what Local Land Services district veterinarians do as a job, I'll also touch on that too, and what we cover and what our role and space is, and ways that you can get in contact with your local district vet, wherever that may be. If you're based in New South Wales, hopefully that is the majority of our participants that is zooming in tonight, but that bit, if it's not so much relating to you, hopefully you can tap into your local equivalent of district vets wherever you're based. So to kick things off, our first little section that we'll tackle is animal nutrition, and in particular feed quality and preventing metabolic diseases. And I don't think we can go past with feed and animal nutrition is matching the supply that we have with demand when we're looking at a pasture-based type system. So I've got a graph from the ProGraze manual up here, and it's for the Southwest Slopes region of New South Wales, it being the one that I work within the most frequently. But what I would suggest is that if you haven't familiarized yourself lately with, or you're working or within a particular new area, get to know your area and have a look at the graphs for your region. See if they line up with your farm and what you're producing on your property or the property that you're involved with and work on, just so that you can get an idea of when the feed base is peaking, when the growth rate is peaking of pastures, so that you're able to match the feed demand that you've got for your livestock with the feed availability and feed on offer for your area. I should also say too, further to what Zoe said, if you've got questions along the way, please do pop them in the chat so that you don't forget them. I know that if I am doing Zoom meetings, sometimes I forget what I was going to ask if I don't just pop it in the chat. So yeah, please do so if you have questions along the way, and I'll hopefully be able to tackle them at the end of our chat this evening. Further to the ProGraze piece and the graph that I've got up here, in the Riverina, we've actually got some ProGraze courses that are being run locally. So if you haven't done one of those, I do really suggest that you get on to seeing if there's one being run in your region. It just helps you to be able to assess the feed that you've got on farm and be able to match that with animals and what they require. Each local land services area has an ag advisory team, and if you are getting in contact with local land services, then they'll be able to put you in contact with people that are running those courses if local land services aren't themselves. So in terms of matching the requirements of your animals to the time that feed is on offer, you have to think about also, so overlaying the feed availability graph with the times of peak feed demand that your animals have on property. So that might be in the lead up to calving, into lactation. And so you've got to have a think about, do those times of peak feed demand correlate with when the peak feed supply is on offer, or do you need to supplement to fill in those troughs along the way? For us, in particular, this graph from the end of winter is when we have the most feed on offer. Then you've also got to have, I suppose, in the back of your mind too, when you have the peak feed intake for calving cows is actually later than when their peak milk yield occurs. So there's a bit of there's a lag time there as well too. So understanding that there will be that gap and deficit until their intake takes off as well too. So particularly when you're feeding into lactation, so you feed from moderate level at the beginning of lactation, and then you're working your way up to peak feed by 12 weeks of lactation, and then you decrease corresponding to that decreasing milk yield throughout lactation when you're thinking about building up that feed and meeting those demands of particularly lactating cows. If you're thinking about this graph and year round, and when you're going to be able to or wanting to increase feed on offer, you might also consider something like a pre-joining flush, and for males and females that needs to occur for 10 weeks prior to joining. So that will also be another layer to add into this type of graph for your particular farm. We're always thinking about maintaining condition score at that 3 out of 5 body condition score, plus also not just assessing what they are on the day, but assessing with what's the future feed availability on offer, and making sure that animals aren't going to go into negative energy balance, particularly in that pre-joining flush when we want to be able to be boosting up that feed in the lead up to joining. When we're thinking about managing heifers, I've just got a little piece about that too, because it's an important part of the animals that we have on farm, and making sure that we're feeding them up to ideal weights and growth rates. So ideally we want to have a rapid growth rate all the way from weaning through to 14 to 16 months, because that's beneficial for both first round conception and reducing the incidence of dystocia. So that achieves a larger pelvic size relative to the calf size. So the target is about 0.6 to 0.7 kilos per head per day from weaning through to when they calve. So from the time that heifer's weaned through to when she calves. Also, that is the same target growth rate, that 0.6 to 0.7 kilos per head per day for that whole of life. For your clients out there that are wanting to achieve that optimal MSA grading and meet quality targets, that growth rate is also optimal to achieve the highest possible MSA grades as well. The next step, I suppose, if you've got that feed production curve and you've identified that there's some troughs, you've got to potentially also assess whether you're going to formulate a ration and supplement the feed that's on offer pasture-wise. There's also a really important distinction to make there too as to whether feed is supplementary or complementary. So a supplementary feed will actually be that the feed is substituted, so the feed or the grain that's put in front of those animals will be substituted from the pasture that they're eating, whereas complementary feeding is when, for example, during dry times, if a molasses type based lick is being fed alongside dry feed, and that actually complements the feed intake and achieves higher intakes because both of those feeds are complementing each other and working together. Comparing that to something like the green feed on the screen and a grain where they're actually supplementing and substituting each other because they've got to pick one of them to have a mouthful of. When you are formulating rations, the first thing to think about is energy for maintenance, and that's the most important thing in the best starting point to go from, because there's so many words being flicked around like energy, protein, fiber, all of that will start with energy. Then you adjust for the stage of production. So do you need to add more energy in for lactation, for the stage of pregnancy, for walking, if there's steep country or they need to walk long distances to feed or water points. For younger animals, it also might be about live weight gain. So adjusting if there's energy step-ups that need to occur for all of those things. Then, because it tends to be the next most limiting factor, is protein requirements. So then you would adjust for or add in potential other feeds based on the protein requirements. So that could include things like if you have a growing animal or lactating animals, those rations require at least 13% crude protein. And actively growing animals require more protein than animals that are just maintaining weight. So that's the next thing you need to think about, and where often high protein supplementary feeds may come in. Another really important thing to consider is fat content in the ration. So higher than 6% fat can impact the digestibility of the ration, as otherwise higher than that, the fat can actually inhibit the microbes to be able to break down the feed. We also want to maintain minimum 10% roughage for that optimal rumen function as well. And that needs to be at least muzzle width in length to be effective. So they're just some considerations to think about if you're thinking about formulating a ration and supplementing the feed that's on offer in the paddock during those peaks, like when there's those troughs in the graphs that I had up earlier. There's also a really important consideration between the ration that you formulate versus the ration that you mix or feed out versus the ration that is eaten. So monitoring what is actually being eaten and using that as a feedback loop as to how much to feed, or quantities and the quality of feed that you've got there as well are all important considerations. The next thing that I will certainly also touch on, which is super important, is that feed quality is so essential and is determined ultimately by feed testing. So why would you potentially feed test? And that may be something that you think, well, why do I have to do that if I've got values that I can use, that I can pull off the internet? Well, we we want to understand what's happening in the particular feed that we're feeding out. And there's so many different factors that may impact on that about, for example, if it's a hay or a silage, the season that it was made in, the conditions that it was made in, and the quality that ensiling or haymaking was done. So it'll help you to understand the production potential of the feed, how suitable it is for those things that we talked about, so maintenance, production, pregnant, lactating animals. We also want to be able to think ahead and determine if we're going to need that supplementation, if we potentially wanted to sell the feed, and also just to evaluate how well what we're doing on farm, if we are ensiling or making hay, how well that's actually being done, and how much it's actually going to benefit the animals that we've got there on farm. So the things that feed testing are going to be able to tell you is about energy, that very important factor that determines how we develop all rations. It's going to tell us about protein, so that in particular that nitrogen content of the feed. It's going to tell us about the dry matter. So that's especially important in a year like this where there's abundant feed on offer, but it's got very high moisture content. So in terms of bang for the buck for the animals that are actually ingesting it, how many of those mouthfuls, how much of a percentage of that is actually nutrition that's going into their system. Other things that it can tell us by getting a feed test done is the digestibility of the feed, which also varies with the species that's eating it and how much is being fed, but it just gives us a bit of an idea. Fiber content gives us an idea of how digestible the feed is as well, typically, and so we can use, that's usually measured in ADF or NDF. The NDF in particular we can use to determine how much intake the animal might be going to consume, and typically the lower NDF, the more digestible the feed is. With understanding feed quality and feed testing, if you're purchasing in feed, please try and request a commodity vendor declaration or feed test results, just some level of assurance or information about the feed that you're buying in or that's being provided. And same sort of thing goes for feed that's being grown at home. Test the feed to get an idea of how yours is trending against anything that's being bought in, or if you, don't necessarily know the conditions that feed is being stored in, or just to understand what your animals on farm are being fed. And the same thing goes for stored feeds as well as pasture, and the pasture base and system that you've got, especially if there's plentiful amounts of it, understanding what the nutritional value is. An important note on that, if you are getting these feed test bags, like the picture on the right-hand side of the slide, from your local land services or Department of Primary Industries office, you can request all different feed tests that are on offer there. If you are using a very commonly tested feed, you can use the NIR testing. It's slightly cheaper, but it works quite well if it's a very standard type of feed that you're going to test. However, if you've got like a mixed pasture sward or something that's less commonly used or less commonly tested for, it's really important to select wet chemistry testing. It's that little bit more expensive, but it will give you a much more valid test result. But if you have any questions, just contact the customer service team at the DPI Feed Service Testing, and they'll provide you with plenty of information about which test to get and quotes on how much that test will cost. Just a note on preventing metabolic diseases. With mineral supplementation, calcium and magnesium, I'll have a bit of a chat about them, about hypomag and hypocal. Calcium deficiency, hypocalcemia, tends to occur in those older cows, so greater than 5 years old. They tend to be late pregnancy, and also it may occur after calving if they've got periods of stress. Tends to also be in higher producing cows, if they've had a history of hypocalcemia. Alkaline diets can also cause hypocalcemia. If the cow has had a low calcium intake after calving, but she was having a high amount of calcium beforehand, that can also mess with the calcium mobilization that the body is otherwise programmed to be able to do. If there's a low roughage intake, and also cows that are much in a higher fat score than like 3.5, 4 are also higher risk. With avoiding causing hypocalcemia, some tips there are obviously, avoiding over fattening cows, ensuring constant access to feed during calving, so minimizing any time off feed, avoiding access to high risk pastures. That pasture on the picture on the slide is I suppose what you'd typically call like a grass tetany pasture, low amount of available pasture there, but yeah, similar risk factors for both calcium, low calcium and low magnesium. Feeding hay before and during calving is also important to make sure that they've got access to roughage. Making sure that if you're going to have calcium intake, that it's like in the lead up to calving, that it's lower before calving than when calving commences, or at least the same, rather than having it higher before calving and then stepping it down. Feed as much calcium as physically possible after calving when their calcium demands are highest as they're lactating, and also having a think about the herd structure. If you've got lots of older cows, they're going to be of high risk. On the magnesium front, calcium is much better stored in bones than magnesium. Magnesium, they've only got very minimal stores, and otherwise it's just all circulating around in their blood. So once they use up that magnesium, unless they're getting more down their throats, they're not able to have enough to function as they need to. So all the risk factors for hypomagnesemia are like if the feed's not palatable, if there's bad weather, if there's yarding or transport, if there's pastures like the one in the picture on the slide there, so low availability of feed or short grass. So the ways to minimize risk there are to supplement with magnesium, like treating hay with Cause Mag, and also providing like magnesium loose licks and available magnesium to the animals in the paddock. So yeah, the prevention with magnesium and hypomag is absolutely key, because typically when people think they've got a problem, it's because they see dead animals, unfortunately. So yeah, having all of those, understanding those risk factors and having those prevention methods in place are absolutely key. On the macro and micro minerals front, otherwise, a lot of our mineral type deficiencies do present as ill thrift. So very non-specific, poor coat, or not growing as well as animals we would like them to, or not getting in calf, that type of thing. If you're concerned about ill thrift and potential mineral deficiencies, reach out to your district veterinarian or veterinarian that you're working with to discuss investigation of that, because it can be, a lot of the time we can measure those deficiencies, but they're all quite different and intricate, and it's about sort of factoring in soil testing, paddock history, farm history, the production status of the animals, and then it may look like things like blood testing or tissue testing. So it's very specific to the farm and the area. So yeah, if that's something that is on your mind, please do get in contact, but it's very farm specific. Also on preventing metabolic disease, a note on roughage. why it's so important is it keeps that rumen working, but it slows down transit time of feed through the gut because it's bulkier and helps to better absorb all those essential minerals that we need. And it also provides that vehicle to feed those supplementary minerals like the lime and cause mag to be able to prevent the metabolic diseases. I'll just jump through now onto the post-flood animal health impacts. And as mentioned previously, this information has been provided by North Coast Local Land Services. I've also done a fair bit of research in the lead up to this about diseases and issues that we can see with floods. So hopefully I'll do it justice. If you have some specific questions, more than happy to work through them as well. But yeah, it is, I suppose, something in particular that this year has been affecting regions outside of mine, and so hopefully I'll be able to draw on the learnings from those particular areas. With our animal health impacts, there's lots of potential health and welfare considerations around flooding, which, as we know, in the first instance, involves getting those animals to safety, onto feed and water, and to account for the stock that are there. There are many livestock diseases that have increased risk of occurrence as a result of flooding. So the ones to keep a particular eye on, and the ones to keep a watch out for, are things like gastrointestinal diseases such as yersiniosis, also known as mud scours. So that's a bacterial disease that animals are more prone to from having that waterlogging and mud contamination of feed. Another consideration is parasites such as Barber's pole worm, small intestinal worms, stomach worms, and liver fluke. Bacterial infections of the hooves can occur due to injuries and nicks and grazes and cuts due to the occurrence of flooding. Mastitis in both beef and dairy herds is higher risk as a result of those teats being exposed to ongoing wet weather and conditions and the actual flood event itself. Clostridial infections are something to keep an eye out for, including blackleg and botulism. Fortunately, we do have vaccines for both of those. Another consideration is toxicities due to poisonous plants, which may find themselves growing after that water has subsided, or plants that might have found their way into properties that we haven't typically seen, but the water can move that, obviously. Another consideration is the leptospirosis infections that can occur due to the fact that bacteria is transmitted in water and water-based secretions. Some other things to keep an eye out for are 3-day sickness and pink eye, and just the irritation of the vectors transmitting diseases as well. There was a specific question in the lead up to this webinar about reproductive problems and the effect of flood on reproductive capacity. As far as numbers and data that's come out of the flood events so far this year, there's not too many reports that I've been able to get my hands on about that specifically, but the very event of flooding can lead to, well, it is a very stressful time. The nutrition of the animals is compromised, disease, so leptospirosis, for example, and poor general health conditions may all contribute to reproductive loss or the inability of animals to be able to conceive in the post-flood period. So they're all factors that can impact upon cattle, and are things to understand that may also be, I suppose, the flow-on effects of the post-flood event, and stress being also a major one there. Another important consideration is just lameness in general as the result of trauma. So if those hooves are softened and the lower leg skin is softened, the lameness as an issue can affect all classes of livestock, and basically breaks that skin either above the hoof, around the hoof, in between the claws, and can compromise the feet and lead to that secondary bacterial infection. So some things to consider there for managing that are to try and get those animals onto hard ground as soon as possible, as best as possible, and trying to, if foot baths are required, to dry out those feet, trying to get that happening as well too. In practice, that's obviously very challenging in lots of situations, but I suppose it's just understanding that that is a condition that can occur, and understanding that that will need to be something that needs to be managed. Also on the feet front and all of those diseases front too, that working with your veterinarian during those times and with those cases is super important. If you have issues, we are involved with all of those emergency situations and have veterinarians involved with those responses. And just because the immediate flood response wraps up, the vets are still there and still able to be available for to assist you and to make sure that those animals recover as best as possible. As far as minimising the risk of those conditions that I talked about that could develop post-flood, I was sort of throwing lots of bad things at you about all the different things that can go wrong. But in terms of what actually can be done, preventing access to animal carcasses, providing access to clean, fresh drinking water, considering moving stock from pasture where there's been heavy soil contamination if that's possible, testing cattle for intestinal worms and fluke, and then treating as required, and making sure that that becomes a habit. It's not just, oh, they don't look real flash, we'll do that now, just so that it's a regular occurrence, and that then they're able to be tackled, those issues are tackled before they become too much of a production issue. With vaccination for clostridial diseases, 5-in-1 and then 7-in-1 vaccine include your leptospirosis vaccinations. The use of botulism vaccine is also highly recommended for cattle producers that have been involved in flood events. And then also monitoring paddocks for new weeds that may have come into contact with floodwaters, and feed for any poisonous plants. On the nutrition front, we've sort of really touched on nutrition and the absolute crux of it already, but just to sort of reiterate some points, post-flood nutrition revolves around considering that supplementary feeding to fill feed gaps. If feed is to be bought in, please do the feed testing so that you know what you're feeding out and how you can best formulate rations. Feed budgeting is absolutely essential to make those timely decisions if you're going to buy in feed or look for feed options elsewhere, like agistment. Other factors to potentially be considered on the nutrition front are infrastructure. So if you've got the right storage and equipment for feeding out those stored feeds like silage and grains, to try and minimise waste in the paddock by using hay feeders and troughs, and providing adequate clean water, preventing feeding areas becoming boggy by feeding on harder surfaces. If you don't have that permanent feeding for harder surfaces, moving that feeding infrastructure, or some temporary solutions like creating a mound of road base or using matting to try and make sure that it doesn't become too boggy. Feed will very likely have to be prioritised to certain mobs, so consider feeding those classes of stock separately if they're not already. Any new feeds need to be introduced gradually into the diet to reduce any digestive upset, especially for grains. And pick a few animals in the mob to weigh or regularly check and record their body condition scores so that you can make sure that you're on track. Be prepared to adjust those plans and seek advice if you need it, because there are people, particularly within LLS, that are super happy to help and to create feed budgets for you and to work with what you have or what you potentially have access to buy in feed-wise post-flooding. Before we jump into and finish up with some questions, I'll just touch on biosecurity, and in particular with our emergency animal disease prevention and preparedness for foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, and bringing it home with what you can do on your farm. So we're all quite familiar with, I'm sure, on this webinar tonight, what the signs of foot and mouth disease are, but it's super important that everyone working with livestock know the signs of FMD and also lumpy skin disease and what to do if they suspect those. So as mentioned, many of you would know, foot and mouth disease can affect all cloven hoofed animals, including cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, deer. The absolute key signs are blisters, erosions, and drooling. Lumpy skin disease affects only cattle and buffalo. The skin lesions are those key signs, those nodules turning into abscesses, but some cattle may not have obvious lumps, and only about 50% of infected cattle show clinical signs. Reporting immediately is the absolute key to diagnosing and containing any early cases of these diseases. Please contact your district vet directly if you have their number. You could also contact your local land services office to get in contact with your nearest available district vet, or if you don't have the district vet's number, pop in the Emergency Animal Disease Watch hotline, that 1-800-675-888. Save that in your phone. And if you can access that hotline, if you're unable to get onto your DV, that's a fantastic one to be able to chat to. It's 24 hours a day and you get to speak with a government vet who is very knowledgeable on the matter. What you can be doing at your end, especially in New South Wales, is complete your annual land and stock return and update your National Livestock Identification System database. So everyone on here is going to have a pick, and you're all going to be LPA accredited, but make sure that with your tags and any property to property transfers that are happening, particularly in the springtime with our sire buying season, making sure that those animals have been transferred onto your pick and that all of your transfers are up to date within that 2-day period. Also, it might be a timely reminder to do a pick reconciliation, and that's when you just do an audit on all the livestock on your property with all the devices and work out what's still there, what needs to be inactivated, and what's moved off. And it's just, yeah, a good time as ever to do that one. Swill feeding, I'll just quickly touch on for any of those out there who have pigs on the property or no pigs are in their local area. The most likely entry point for foot and mouth disease is the illegal importation of contaminated milk or meat products, which are subsequently fed illegally to pigs. So that's just, yeah, something to, if you know someone that's got pigs or a pet pig, and if it's just even if it's just a reminder to let them know that they need to not feed swill, that's just one little take home from tonight that I'd love to just keep on everyone's radar. With lumpy skin disease, as we all know, we're currently free from it, but our biting flies, mosquitoes and ticks are those vectors which may potentially bring it in. So we're thinking about, with managing for it, integrated insect management. So making sure that we're monitoring for any insects that are around, managing the environment to keep down any risk of those insects reproducing. So if you can remove water sources around the property, like puddles and water that doesn't need to otherwise be held around the property. If animals are being brought onto the property, making sure that those are quarantined, those cattle, and also keeping really good records of any chemical controls that are used to control insects. Biosecurity planning, farm biosecurity plan. Everyone's got their farm biosecurity plan from their LPA accreditation in 2017. Now is a great time to update that if you haven't recently. Just have a think about all the things that you can control about people coming and going from your farm. So do you get them to have another pair of boots, the visitors that come onto your farm? Do you get them to sign a visitor log? Do you get them to you get them to park their vehicle in a particular spot, or do you get them to wash their vehicle as they come onto the property? So all of those things are considerations to have when you're updating your farm biosecurity planning. Ooh, apologies, I skipped ahead a little bit far. Have a think about having these signs on your property if you don't already. We've got them at our local land services offices available. And with a suspect emergency animal disease and where the district vets come in, I just wanted to touch on that about what happens if you have a suspect emergency animal disease and you call the vet out to investigate. You may contact your private vet, or you might contact your district vet. The district vet will come out, get all the details, the history and the clinical signs, and then potentially also examine the sick stock, might do feed or paddock inspections and post-mortems of affected animals. Then the samples, if need be, will be sent to the laboratory, the state laboratory, for testing, where the diseases are ruled out in priority order based on those emergency animal diseases, ruling them out in the first instance, but still working through to get a disease diagnosis due to the fact that there's so many other diseases that are endemic here in Australia that could be. So that is pretty much all the guts of what I was going to cover tonight. I did just, I suppose, really briefly touch on the biosecurity stuff, because I know that potentially also too many of our viewers tonight will have received lots of information about biosecurity over the last few months. But on the district veterinarians front, the number to call is, I've really got that confusing there. The number is the 1300 795 299 to contact your local land services office. Sorry, please remove the 8138. But if you contact the 1300 number, your LLS office, that'll take you to the office, and then they'll be able to get you onto your district vet if you don't already have their number. Report your animal disease emergencies after hours to the emergency animal disease hotline, as we talked about earlier. And if you want to request an online information request from your veterinarian, you can also jump on our website, and then that'll take you to your local region, and you'll be able to also find your local regional contacts on the website too. So that's it officially. Well, yeah, for all my pre-prepared stuff. Thanks, Zoe. And if there's any questions, happy to take them now.
Thanks so much, Gianni. And that is just fantastic. I think we all learned a lot tonight, and especially with such a dynamic environment at the moment. There's lots of changes happening, and it's all about adapting and yeah, really looking closely at your stock of what they need, because things are changing so much so quickly lately. So we'll just go to questions. Please, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat box there. If you move your mouse, it should appear. And that chat box, if you type in there, yep, you should be able to send that through. If we have any questions there, we'll just wait a minute or two. We really do encourage members to send through questions. It really is a good time while we do have an expert here that can really help with anything you're going through at the moment. Otherwise, if typing's a bit too tricky, you are welcome to unmute your microphone and ask a question and mute.
Hi, it's Nicole here. Can I just ask a question in regards to going back to the heifer weight gains of those 0.6 a day from weaning through to joining? So just saying, is the pelvis size set between that, or can we still get compensatory growth afterwards? Or and you know, you've got puberty in amongst that as well. So yeah, just fine tuning some more commentary on that section.
Hi, thank you for your question. To the best of my knowledge, there is then also pelvic growth following joining, because those animals have reached like to the point of joining that critical mating weight, but then they still have weight to be gained post that time. There's just in the literature, and particularly in that, I suppose, yeah, with the recommendations, those recommendations are designed around the fact that you will help to optimize all of those factors, including that pelvic growth rate, and that pelvic diameter. So certainly the fact that the pelvic growth will continue on after that, but in that time and by achieving those growth rates, you'll be able to optimize that. I hope that sort of, yeah, speaks to that point, in that it's certainly not the end of the road there by the time that those animals are joined, but it just helps to, I suppose, make sure that all of that can be as optimized as possible if those if that can be achieved, those growth rates. The weight that's ideal for joining will depend on your mature cow weight. So that being that that critical mating weight that those animals achieve, it sits around that 65% of the mature cow weight. So obviously, if they can have achieved that, that's obviously what they need to be able to reach puberty and to be able to cycle to conceive, and then that will also revolve around your particular mature cow weight for working out, then tracking that back to the weight that they will join at as well. And also what works best for you, like just because the critical mating weight's been achieved, you might also like them to have a little bit more weight on than that, so that they are able to conceive and also maintain the pregnancy, and do well in themselves and grow in themselves, as well as growing the conceptus too. But to that question asker, happy to also chat post the webinar. I'm happy for Zoe and the team to pass on my contact details to work with you through how you would potentially calculate your ideal joining weight as well.
Jenny, I had a question. Oh, sorry, was that someone else? I'll just quickly ask, you mentioned that when there's so much moisture in the ground, that the nutritional value of the pastures often, can decrease because there's so much more moisture in there. Are you finding that around the Riverina or particular areas more so than others lately in these last wet years?
Yeah, definitely. I think particularly this year, it's been a little bit more evident. I don't know whether it's because there's been a little bit more like minerals and that real substance in a lot of that pasture that's like leached out of the pasture, sort of, for want of a better term. We certainly have seen people reporting that their animals are not doing as well as they typically would on pasture of that height or that apparent quality, like that visual inspection. And I think that's why that feed quality testing and getting samples and doing that testing is so important, to understand that the dry matter of that pasture is actually quite low, or the metabolizable energy, that ME content, is also low typically, compared to perhaps what we see in other years when there's a little bit more substance to the pasture. We do love like a fast, actively growing green feed, like it is, a green fast growing feed usually correlates with a fast growing animal, but you still do want a little bit of substance in there, and converting that to dry matter in that plant matter, rather than just all moisture content. And it's certainly something that we're seeing. It's also something that's going to have to be on our radar, as we have a few like failed crops and things with too much moisture across the region. If people are trying to graze those as well, that's going to be something that we've got to keep on our radar to understand how to graze them too. There's another sort of follow-up question here about, should you be concerned if your cow's manure is like water, but they're still putting on weight at those times when the pasture is quite wet? I would say no, I wouldn't be concerned that the manure, is like water, because it is such a high water content coming through. That is also, though, if there is plenty of roughage and feed in, like dry feed, also on offer in front of the animal. So if you don't have the roughage there, we're not actually able to get the most out of the pasture there, because it's the transit time of that feed is far too fast through the gut. So if it's water in, it'll be water out. If we can have water in plus a little bit of roughage, we can slow down the transit time of that feed through the gut and draw out any nutrients that are there. So if you've got roughage on offer and the manure is like that, that's just what it is, because it's such high moisture content in the pasture. But if you don't have the roughage content out there, I'd strongly recommend that you have that in the paddock and available for feed. Thanks, Georgia, for your question and feedback there too. On the bovine ephemeral fever front, so 3-day sickness, will that be a greater issue this year in areas where it hasn't been so common because it's such a wet year? I think it's absolutely got to be on our radar as something that we consider in areas typically further than what it has been. And that I think the Japanese encephalitis outbreak in pigs, following the summer that we've just had, and it being seen in areas far beyond areas where we've ever seen it before, I think really speaks to that, and how it's got to be on our radar for other animals and other diseases. So BEF is certainly one of those. So yeah, if it's not typically something you see in your area, but all the signs are adding up and you need to get someone out to do some diagnosis, which I strongly suggest you do, so that we can keep an eye on what's going on. And also, like, all of that disease diagnosis too helps the whole region, because if there's an outbreak in one part of the region, you can say, well, this is what's happening, everyone needs to keep an eye out. We can all sort of work through this to combat how to work with affected animals, recover affected animals together, rather than necessarily being like, oh, you know, we just won't say anything, or we'll just keep it under wraps on our farm. It actually benefits the whole industry and you know, for example, this whole the genetic hub that you're all tuning in from tonight. So yeah, I think it's a super important thing, if you're noticing a disease you perhaps haven't seen before, to get in contact with your district vet or on the EAD hotline.
Just a reminder, this webinar will also be recorded, which you've probably noticed there's the little recording icon there. So we'll certainly distribute this out to everyone who's registered tonight first. So you can just hash over parts you want to have another look at, and then we'll certainly circulate this out further to the breed societies under Genetic Hub too, so you can all have a closer look at anything that you might have missed. If there's any further questions, feel free to use your microphone or the chat box there as well. All right, well, I think there were some great questions there as well. To reiterate a few points there, we'll leave it at that for tonight. But yes, as Dione said, there's certainly the Riverina LLS contacts will circulate, that you can contact Dione directly if you have any other questions. And if you are looking for a district vet for assistance, certainly reach out and we can help you get in touch. In the meantime, stay safe out of this crazy weather, stay dry, and hopefully animals can stay a bit dry. But we'll certainly tune in again soon, and we hope you can join our next webinar you'll hear more about soon. So thank you so much, Dione, for all your work tonight and research and preparations. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone took away some really important things tonight, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from a few people with some questions for sure. So thank you so much. It's been really great.
Thank you, and yeah, happy to chat further if people have questions.
Very good. All right. Well, we might leave it there, and yeah, I'm sure we'll we'll touch base soon. So thank you everyone for tuning in tonight and listening in. We really appreciate it. Thanks everyone.